My dear sir, you are very, very kind in your hints as to the sort of composition which might recommend me a present. And I am fully sensible that an historical romance might be much more to the purpose of profit or popularity than such pictures of domestic life as I deal in. But I cannot write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my own life. And if it were indispensable for me to make the attempt, I am sure I should be hung before I had finished the first chapter. Your very much obliged and very sincere friend, Jane Austen. No, must keep to my own style and go my own way. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. Getting them into exactly such a spot as is the delight of my life. Emma Woodhouse. Handsome, clever, and rich, had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to vex her. She was born the most young daughter of a most indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his home from a very early period. Her mother had died long ago, and her place was supplied by Miss Taylor, an excellent woman as governess, who had fallen little short of a mother and father. Sorrow came when Miss Taylor married.
Oh, Miss Taylor! What a pity it is that Mr. Weston ever thought of her.
Mr. Weston is such a good-humoured man, Papa, that he would not have had Miss Taylor live with us forever when she might have had a house of her own. We must pay our wedding visit very soon.
Oh, no, my dear. Randalls is such a distance. I could not walk half so far.
Nobody thought of your walking, Papa. We must go in the carriage, to be sure.
Mr. George Knightley.
It is very kind of you to come out at this late hour to call upon us.
You must have found it very damp and dirty. I hope you did not catch cold.
Dirty, sir? Look at my shoes, not a speck on them.
How interesting, for we have had a vast deal of rain here. I had wished they'd put off the wedding. Poor Miss Taylor, 'tis a sad business.
Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, perhaps, but I cannot say poor Miss Taylor. It must be better for the new Mrs. Weston to have only one to please than 2.
Especially when one of those 2 is such a fanciful, troublesome creature. That is what you would say my father, not I.
It is very true, my dear. I am sometimes quite fanciful and troublesome.
My dearest Papa, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know. In a joke. It is all a joke. We always say what we like to one another.
Emma knows I never flatter her, but I meant no reflection on anybody. Mrs. Weston used to have 2 persons to please, and she will now have but 1. But what of Mr. Weston's son? Has he been here on this occasion?
Mr. Frank Weston Churchill has not been here yet. There was strong expectation of his coming, but it ended in nothing. I am persuaded that Mr. and Mrs. Weston think Frank Churchill the very person to suit me, so I have great curiosity to see him. His arrival, I fear, depends entirely upon his aunt's temper.
Ah, yes, the great Mrs. Churchill.
Everybody knows Mrs. Churchill. She is so very unreasonable and everything must bend to her wishes. She has given her nephew a superior name and the promise of a fortune, but has kept him from his own father's wedding.
Well, I hope, in spite of that, it went tolerably well. How did you all behave? Who cried the most?
We all behaved charmingly, with hardly a tear to be seen.
Dear Anna bears everything so well, but she really is very sad to be losing poor Miss Taylor.
You have forgotten one matter of joy to me, that I made the match myself.
Interesting. You made the match.
I did, 4 years ago, and to be proved right when so many people said Mr. Weston would never marry again, they comfort me for anything.
You made a lucky guess, and that is all that can be said.
Dear Emma never thinks of herself when she can be of help to others. But pray, my dear, make no more matches. They work against one's family circle grievously.
I promise to make none for myself, Papa. But I must indeed make one more for Mr. Elton. He has been erected here a whole year and fitted out his house so comfortably that it would be a shame to have him single any longer.
Invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife.
Oh, Mr. Martin.
Miss Smith,
Only imagine now happening to meet. How very odd.
I did not think you walked this way.
Harriet Smith. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from scholar to boarder. Emma found her altogether very engaging. She decided to notice Harriet, improve her, and introduce her into good society. For poor Mrs. Weston, there was nothing more to be done. For Harriet, everything.
Well, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think of Mr. Martin? I thought him very plain at first, but not now.
He is remarkably plain, Harriet, but that is nothing compared with his entire want of gentility.
To be sure, he is not so genteel as real gentlemen. He's not like Mr. Knightley.
This farm you've been visiting, Mr. Martin rents it of Mr. Knightley, does he not?
Oh, yes. He and his mother have 2 parlors and 8 cows. One of them is a very pretty little Welsh cow. As I was so fond of it, they said that it should be called my cow. And one day, Mr. Martin went 3 miles round to get me wool. But did you never see him? He passes by here very often.
A young farmer is the very last sort of person to raise my curiosity. A degree or 2 lower might interest me. I might hope to be useful to the family in some way. But a farmer can be none of my help. He is as much above my notice as he is below it. What do you imagine his age to be?
He was 24 in the last 8th of June.
That is too young to settle. 6 years from now, if he could meet with a good sort of young woman in the same rank as his own.
6 years! Dear Miss Woodhouse, he would be 30 years old.
That is as early as most men can afford to marry, who are not born to an independence.
But they live very comfortably.
I have no doubt that he will thrive, Harriet. But it does not follow that you might marry anybody fit for you to notice. The misfortune of your birth ought to make you particularly careful. There can be no doubt of your being a gentleman's daughter, and you must support your claim to that station by everything within your power. I want to see you permanently well connected. Mr. Elton is the very person to drive the young farmer from Harriet's head. He already thinks her beautiful, and anybody who would be gratified by Robert Martin's riding about the country to get walnuts for her may very well be conquered by a fine rector's admiration.
Emma was already quite convinced of Mr. Elton's being in love. He often spoke of the improvement in Harriet's manners since her introduction at Hartfield, and Emma could not suppose anything wanting which a little time could not add.
What an exquisite possession a picture of Harriet will be. Do you not think so, Mr. Elton?
Oh, it will indeed be a delight. You do well, Miss Woodhouse, to exercise such a charming talent in favor of your friend.
Well, since you give me such kind encouragement, I am happy to try what I can do. Did you ever sit for a picture, Harriet?
Oh dear, no, never.
Harriet's features are so very delicate, which makes for a life that's difficult.
You have given Miss Smith all that she required, Miss Woodhouse. She was a beautiful creature before she came here, but, in my opinion, the attractions you have added are infinitely superior to those she received from nature.
Harriet only wanted drawing out. I have done very little.
How do you do, Mr. Elton?
Very well, thank you, Mr. Woodhouse. Mrs. Weston? Mr. Knightley?
The expression of the eye is most correct, but Miss Smith has not those eyebrows or eyelashes.
Oh, I cannot agree with you, Mrs. Weston. It appears a most perfect resemblance.
You will be giving your friend the most beauty she has ever wanted.
You have made her too tall, Emma.
Oh, no, not in the least too tall. Consider she's sitting down, and her proportions must be preserved, you know.
It's very pretty, my dear. The only thing I do not like is she seems to be sitting out of doors, and it makes one think she must catch cold.
But my dear Papa, it is supposed to be a warm day in summer. Look at the tree.
It is never safe to sit out of doors.
But any other situation would have remained much less in character. Oh, it is most admirable. I cannot keep my eyes away from it.
But we must send it to Isabella in London immediately to see that it is properly framed.
Oh no, my dear. I cannot bear the thought of your sister stirring about in the fogs of December. Poor Isabella. Nobody's healthy in London. Nobody can be.
Now, if I might be trusted with the commission, Miss Woodhouse, I shall take infinite pleasure in executing it.
Oh, you are too good, Mr. Elton. I would not give you such a troublesome office for the world.
Oh, it is impossible to say, Miss Woodhouse, how much I would be gratified by being employed on such an errand.
Very well, then. This man is almost too gallant. But I suppose there must be 100 different ways of being in love. He will suit Harriet exactly.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, something extraordinary has happened. I had just gotten back from Mrs. Goddard's when I received a letter from Mr. Martin containing a proposal of marriage.
Proposal of marriage?
Yes, he writes as if he loves me very much. But I do not know what I should do, and that's why I've come as fast as I can to you. Is it a good letter, do you think? Or is it too short?
A very good letter. I could hardly imagine the man I saw talking with you could express himself so well. You must answer it, of course, and speedily.
But what shall I say?
Oh no, the response must be your own. Expressions of gratitude and concern for the pain you will be inflicting will present themselves and fit into your mind, I am sure.
You think I ought to refuse him then?
That is a point you must settle with your own feelings. However, I lay it down as a general rule that if a woman doubts as to whether she should accept a man or not, she certainly ought to refuse him. Marriage is not a state to be entered into with half a heart.
It will be safer to say no, perhaps. I had better say no.
Not for the world, but I advise you either way. If you prefer Mr. Martin to every other person you have ever been in company with, why should you hesitate? You blush, Harriet. Does someone else come to you at this moment? I fancy you and I are the only people whom the attentions of a certain person, his looks and manners, have explained themselves. A woman that is not to marry a man merely because he can write a tolerable letter.
That's very true, and it is but a short letter. I do not put your mind so very much.
Let us consider those among our absent friends who are more cheerfully employed. At this moment, perhaps, Mr. Elton is sharing your picture with his mother and sisters.
But he's left my picture on Bond Street to be framed.
Oh, no, my modest little Harriet. It is his companion all this evening, his solace, his delight. It opens his designs to his family and introduces you among them. How cheerful, how busy their imaginations all are.
Harriet slept at Hartfield that night. For some weeks past, she had been spending more than half her time there, gradually getting a bedroom appropriated to herself. Emma judged it best in every respect to keep her with them as much as possible.
I have reason to believe that Harriet Smith will soon receive an offer of marriage. Robert Martin came to Donwell Abbey 2 evenings ago to consult me about it, and I was very pleased with all he had to say.
He wrote yesterday and was refused.
Refused? Then Harriet Smith is a greater simpleton than I ever believed her to be. I hope you are mistaken.
I saw her answer. Nothing could be clearer.
You saw her answer. You wrote her answer too, Emma. This is your doing.
Mr. Martin's a very respectable young man, but I cannot admit him to be Harriet's equal.
Your infatuation blinds you. What are Harriet Smith's claims to any connection higher than Robert Martin? She is not a sensible girl. She's been taught nothing useful. She is pretty and good-tempered, and that is all.
I would be very much mistaken if your sex in general would not think beauty and good temper the highest things a woman can possess.
Upon my word, Emma, better to be without sense than misapply it as you do. You make no secret of your matchmaking, but if Elton is the man, it will be labor in vain. Elton knows the value of a good income as well as anybody. He may talk sentimentality, but he will act rationally. Good day.
I have done nothing which women's friendship and feelings would not justify. And Mr. Elton has gone to London with Harriet's picture, though it was his wish tonight, which he has never been known to miss before. Dr. Perry told him how shabby it was in him, their first player, to absent himself. But Mr. Elton said in a very particular way that he was going on business which he would not put off for any inducement in the world.
The picture of Harriet, elegantly framed, came safely to hand soon after Mr. Elton's return, and he sighed out his admiration just as he ought. As for Harriet's feelings, they were visibly forming themselves into as strong an attachment as her youth and sordid mind admitted, a mind that Emma thought to improve further by useful reading. But the only literary pursuit which engaged Harriet at present was the transcribing of riddles into a thin quarto of hot-pressed paper.
A riddle, Miss Woodhouse, which a friend of mine addressed to a young lady, the object of his admiration. Now, being my friends, I have no right to expose it to the public eye. And do not offer it for Miss Smith's collection. But perhaps you may not dislike looking at it.
Why, thank you, Mr. Elton. Will you take tea?
I cannot. I call only to leave you this. Good afternoon, Miss Woodhouse. Miss Smith.
It is for you! I'm convinced this is no friend's riddle, but his own. This is saying very plainly, pray, Miss Smith, approve my charade and my attentions in the same glance.
Behold him there, the monarch of the seas. What could it be, Miss Woodhouse? Neptune or a shark? No, shark is only one syllable.
My dear Harriet, what are you thinking of? My first displays the wealth and pomp of kings, lords of the earth, their luxury and ease. That is court. Another view of man my second brings. Behold him there, the monarch of the seas. That is ship, Harriet, plain as can be. Now for the creed. Our united but reverse we have, man's boasted power and freedom, all our flower. Lord of the earth and sea, he bends a slave, and woman, lovely woman, reigns in love. Court, ship, Harriet.
Court, ship.
Courtship, oh, Miss Woodhouse! I must congratulate you, my dear Harriet, with all my heart.
Miss Woodhouse, whatever you say is always right, and therefore I suppose it must be so, otherwise I could never have believed it.
Your marrying will be equal to the marriage of Mr. Weston and my dear Miss Taylor. There does seem to be something in the air of Hartfield which gives love exactly the right direction.
That does make me wonder that a woman charming like you should not be married.
My being charming is not enough to induce me to marry. I must find other people charming. One other person at least. If I were to marry, I must expect to repent it.
Dear me, it is odd to hear a woman talk so.
Few women are half so much mistress of their husband's household as I am of Hartfield, and never could I imagine expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right, in any man's eyes as I am in my father's.
To be an old maid then, like Miss Bates.
If I thought I should ever be like Miss Bates, I would marry tomorrow. A single woman of very narrow income must be a ridiculous old maid. A single woman of good fortune is always respectable. But come, I have a charitable visit to pay to a poor sick family a little way out of Highbury. Our road is down Vicarage Lane, past the above our blessed Mr. Elphick. I get you in your riddle book one of these days.
Mr. Elton must now be left to himself. It was no longer in Emma's power to quicken his measures. The coming of her sister's family from London became her prime object of interest. John and Isabella Knightley and their 5 children arrived safely, and Mr. Knightley was called to Hartfield to greet his brother and sister-in-law. Emma hoped that she and Mr. Knightley might now become friends again, and it might rather assist the restoration of friendship that when he came into the room, she had one of Isabella's children with her, the youngest, a little girl.
What a comfort it is that we think alike about our nieces and nephews. As to men and women, our opinions are often very different. But in regards to these children, I observe we never disagree.
You are little as under the power of fancy in your dealings with men and women as you are with these children are concerned. We might always think alike.
To be sure, our discordancies must always arise from my being in the wrong.
And for good reason. I was 16 years old when you were born.
And no doubt you are much my superior in judgment at that period of our lives. Does not the lapse of 1 and 20 years draw our understandings nearer?
Yes, a good deal nearer.
But not near enough to me the chance of being right if we think differently.
I still have the advantage of you by 16 years' experience and by not being a pretty young woman or a spoiled child. Come now, Emma. Let's be friends and say no more about it. Tell your aunt, little Emma, that she ought to be setting a better example for you than to be renewing old grievances. And if she were not wrong before, she is now.
Very true, little Emma. Grow up to be a better woman than your aunt. Be infinitely more clever and not half so conceited.
There could hardly be a happier creature than Isabella Knightley, going out amongst her old acquaintances with all her children. At Christmas, Mr. Weston would take no trial. They must dine at Randall's. The evening before this great event, Harriet went home with a cold. Emma called on her the next day and, finding her feverish with a bad sore throat, decided to raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton would be depressed when he knew her state, and how they should all miss her at Randall's. But this fine evening ended abruptly with a threat of snow. The carriages were called for, and Emma found, on being escorted into the second one by Mr. Elton, that they were to have a tete-a-tete drive.
Miss Woodhouse, I must avail myself of this precious opportunity to declare sentiments which must thoroughly be well known to you. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I am prepared to die if you refuse me.
You forget yourself, Mr. Elton. You take me for my friend. Any message for Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver, but no more of this to me, if you please.
Miss Smith, what could you possibly mean?
Well, after the behavior I witnessed during the past month to Miss Smith...
Good heaven! I never thought of Miss Smith in the entire course of my never cared whether she were dead or alive, but as your friend. If she has fancied otherwise, then her wishes have misled her, and I'm sorry. No, upon my honor, I thought only of you. Allow me to interpret this interesting silence. It confesses that you've long understood me.
And it confesses no such thing. Am I to believe that you have never sought to recommend yourself particularly to Miss Smith? That you have never thought seriously of her?
Never, madam. Never. Now, Miss Smith is a good sort of girl, and no doubt there are men who are not opposed to. Well, everybody has their level. That's such a loss. No, madam. My visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only, and the encouragement I've received.
I give you encouragement. So you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend, not being aware of the very great inequality of which you are so sensible. As to myself, I have no thoughts of matrimony at present. Ah, we arrived at Hartfield. I must bid you good night. How could I have been so deceived? Such a blow for Harry, that is worst of all. Certainly, I often thought his manners towards me unnecessarily benign, but never for an instant suspected it to mean anything but grateful respect to me as Harriet's friend. Oh, that I had been satisfied in persuading her not to accept Robert Martin. There, I was quite right. There, I should have stopped and left the rest to time and chance.
John and Isabella were not detained long at Hartfield. The weather soon improved, and Mr. Woodhouse was obliged to see the party off. That very evening brought a ceremonious note from Mr. Elton that he was leaving Highbury on his way to Bath to spend a few weeks. Emma resolved to keep Harriet no longer in the dark, and went to see her again at Mrs. Goddard's.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse.
You are feeling better, I hope, Harriet?
Oh, yes, thank you. I am very nearly recovered from my cold.
Good. For I hope you will soon get the better of your other complaint as well.
My other complaint?
Oh, Harriet, it is no easy thing to admit, but for the past 6 weeks I have been grossly mistaken in all my supposings on this one subject. Mr. Elton has proven himself to be the very reverse of what I believed him. Proud, assuming, and little concerned with the feelings of others.
Miss Woodhouse, whatever do you mean?
Poor Harriet. Dear Harriet. I have talked you into being very much attached to this man. You must now appear in the ungracious character of the once-and-gone.
What preferred? Oh, Miss Woodhouse.
I think I shall never be in charity with myself again.
Do not blame yourself on my account, for I blame nobody. The affection of such a man as Mr. Elton would have been too great a distinction, and nobody but so partial and kind a friend would have believed it possible.
Oh, Harriet. All that is amiable is on your side, not my own. I resolve in future to be more humble and discreet, and to repress imagination all the rest of my life.
With Mr. Elton away, conversation at Highbury turned again to the whereabouts of Mr. Frank Churchill, who had still not paid his respects to his father's bride. Emma was not at this time in a state of spirits to care, really, other than as a disappointment to the Westons. Still, as it was desirable that she appear her usual self, she expressed interest in the circumstance.
The Churchills are very likely at fault, but I dare say he could come if he would.
His aunt and uncle will not spare him.
If Frank Churchill wanted to see his father, he would contrive it. We hear of him forever at some watering place or other. A little while ago he was at Weymouth. This proves that he can leave the Churchills.
Yes, sometimes he can.
And those times are whenever he thinks it's worth his while.
It is very unfair to judge anybody's conduct without an intimate knowledge of their situation. We ought to be acquainted with Mrs. Churchill's temper before we can pretend to decide upon what her nephew can do.
There is one thing, my dear Emma, which a man can always do if he chooses, and that is his duty. It is Frank Churchill's duty to pay attention to his father.
I wish you would try to consider what an amiable young man may be likely to feel an opposing those whom he has looked up to all his life.
Your amiable young man is a very weak young man.
I have no idea of his being a weak young man. I feel certain that he is not. You seem determined to think ill of him.
Me? Not at all. I should be ready to acknowledge his merits, but I hear of none. It's so that he's good-looking with smooth, plausible manners.
Then he will be a treasure at Highbury. We do not often look upon fine young men, well-bred and agreeable. We shall think and speak of no one else.
A new topic of conversation was, in Emma's opinion, sorely needed, for lately she and Harriet had had tar and talking with Mr. Elton, and she could not think that Harriet's solace or her own sins required more. So she determined one morning to call on Mrs. and Miss Bates and seek safety in numbers.
Mother! Mother! Mother, Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith are here, Mother.
Do take my seat by the fire, Miss Woodhouse. There's ever so much clothes here.
Thank you, Mrs. Bates, but I will be fine right here.
So kind of you to call your friends. Won't you try a piece of cake? Miss Perry just complimented very much. Dr. Perry has had a letter from Mr. Austen. He is very much engaged with the company of Bath, and is of course a favorite wherever he goes.
How nice. And had Miss Perry used many of a sort?
Well, whenever Mrs. Perry stops by, she always begins by inquiring about our dear niece Jane Fairfax, who is so very great favorite. And whenever she begins inquiring about Jane, I tell her we have just gotten a letter from Jane this morning, and I do not know I've ever seen something more surprised.
I hope Miss Fairfax is well.
Oh, thank you. I have her letter right over here. I was reading it to my mother this morning, for it is such a great pleasure to her. A letter from Jane that she cannot hear it enough. But I really must apologize for the writing. So short a letter, you see, only 2 pages. In general, she writes an entire page and crosses half. My mother often says when the letter is first opened, well, Hetty, now you'll be made to make out all the checker work.
I have no doubt as to the excellence of Miss Fairfax's handwriting. Did you hear that, Mum? Miss Woodhouse has no doubt as to the excellence of our dear Jane's handwriting.
My mother's deafness is very trifling, you see. I only raise my voice. And saying things 2 or 3 times that she's sure to hear. Poor Jane will not come home to see her grandmama at all deafer than she was 2 years ago. It really has been a full 2 years since Jane was here.
Are you expecting Miss Fairfax soon?
Next week! She's set to be here for 3 months. You see, our niece Jane is an orphan. Colonel Campbell, a friend of her father's, took her in, and she became a guest at his home and a favorite with his daughter, Miss Campbell. Colonel Campbell undertook the entire charge of Jane's education, and she was brought up for educating others, with a few £100 making independence impossible. Mrs. Campbell, now Miss Dixon, of course, has persuaded her father and mother to come to Ireland directly, for until she was married last October, she had not been away from them as much as a week. Mr. Dixon has told Jane quite a deal about Ireland, a beautiful place, I fancy.
But in spite of the frank urgency and her own wish of seeing Ireland, Miss Fairfax prefers devoting the time to you and Mrs. Bates.
Yes, entirely of her own choice, and Colonel and Mrs. Campbell think she does quite well. Indeed, they particularly wish her to try her nature there, for Jane has not been quite so well as usual lately, not since Miss Campbell's marriage.
I'm concerned to hear it.
You're so kind to say so. Well, let us turn to Mrs. Aunt Jane's letter, for I am sure she tells her story a great deal better than I can.
I am afraid I must bid you good morning, Miss Bates. My father will be expecting us.
Oh, so soon? Well, it was so nice seeing you, Miss Woodhouse. Miss Smith?
Good morning, Mrs. Bates. Mrs. Bates!
Well, we have heard the whole substance of Jane Fairfax's letter, but we've managed to read the letter itself.
Do you know Miss Bates, please?
We are always forced to be acquainted whenever she comes to Highbury, because we are the same age. Heaven forbid I should bore people half so much about my nieces and nephews together as Miss Bates does about Jane Fairfax.
Why Emma did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. It was a dislike so unjust that she never saw Jane Fairfax any time after a considerable absence without feeling that she had injured her and determining that she would dislike her no longer. These are charming sentiments, but not lasting.
And Mr. and Mrs. Dixon.
Also well.
Miss Bates tells me Mr. Dixon is an amiable young man.
Yes.
Then you find the match quite suitable.
The Campbells are very well pleased.
Still, their daughter must live so very far from them in Ireland.
That is true. But it is lovely, or so I've been told.
And yet you chose not to accompany the Campbells on their visit back.
Yes.
Miss Woodhouse, did you know our dear Jane and Mr. Frank Churchill were in Weymouth at the same time?
Oh? And was he handsome?
I believe he was reckoned a very fine young man.
Yes?
Yes.
Miss Fairfax, could we trouble you to play for us once more?
Oh yes, Jane plays so beautifully.
I cannot forgive her. She is so cold, so cautious, wrought and spoke of politeness. She is disgustingly, suspiciously reserved.
I'm glad you made Miss Fairfax play so much. For having no pianoforte at her grandmother's must have been a real indulgence.
I hope I'm not often deficient in what is due to guests at Hartfield.
No, you're not often deficient. Neither manner or comprehension.
Miss Fairfax is reserved.
But I always told you she was. A little, but you will soon overcome all that. My dear Emma, you are not going to tell me, I hope, that you had not a pleasant evening.
Oh no! I was quite pleased with my own perseverance in asking questions, and amused to think how little information I obtained.
I am disappointed. Your dislike of Jane Fairfax is quite unreasonable. Can it be that you see in her the really accomplished young woman you want to be thought yourself?
She's elegant. I have never denied it.
But confess, Emma, there are moments when your conscience cannot fully acquit you.
I hope everybody's having a wonderful evening.
I am. I like old friends.
Mr. Woodhouse, did you hear Mr. Elton is getting married? Miss Hawkins, that's all I know. Miss Hawkins is back.
Mr. Elton!
You know, my dear, young people are in such a rush to get married.
And to marry strangers, too.
A new neighbor for us all. It is such happiness when two good people to get together. Oh, but I must be going. The weather does not look well. And Jane, I would not have you out in the shower. Mr. Knightley, you are too kind. Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. Yes, an agreeable piece of news indeed.
Most welcome piece of news, for Mr. Elton would not have suffered long. He has been gone only 4 weeks. I'm sorry for Harriet. Harriet must feel it.
Well, Miss Woodhouse, what do you suppose has happened? I had just set out when Mrs. Goddard and it began to rain, so I took shelter at Ford's shop. And who should come in but Elizabeth Martin and her brother,
Robert Martin?
Yes, I hardly even knew. He spoke, and I answered. So I took courage and said that I must go. And he said that if I were on my way to Hartfield, I must take away by Dr. Perry Stables, for I shall find the near way quite floated by this rain. So I said that I was very much obliged, as you know I could do no less. And then I came round. I believe I did. I hardly even knew. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again.
Calm yourself, Harriet. It is a mere trifle and not worthy of being dwelt upon. You seem to have behaved extremely well, and it is over.
That's very true. Although there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him behave so pleasantly.
Put Robert Martin out of your mind, Harry. There is other news.
Mr. Elton is to marry a Miss Hawkins of Bath. Oh dear.
A measure of relief from this blow was soon provided. The Frank Churchill so long talked about finally arrived, and was presented to Mr. Woodhouse and Emma by an exultant Mr. Weston. Emma did not think too much had been said in the young man's praise.
I was always glad he did not come at Christmas. Now we are going to have just the right weather for him. Fine, dry, settled weather. We shall enjoy his presence completely.
I am surprised he is already 23. He was but 2 years old when his mother died and he left to live with his aunt and uncle. How the time has flown. My memory is very, very bad.
And how do you find Randall's, Mr. Churchill?
I am very much pleased with it. My father's marriage has been the wisest measure. I was prepared for agreeable manners in Mrs. Weston, but I was not prepared to find a pretty young woman as well.
You cannot see too much perfection in Mrs. Weston's formality. But do not let her imagine that you have spoken of her as a pretty young woman.
Depend upon it. I understand whom I might praise with. I am in danger of being thought extravagant in my terms.
Well, I have business at the Crown, but I do not mean to hurry anybody else.
As you are going further, sir, I will take the opportunity of paying a visit. I have the honor of being acquainted with a neighbor of yours, a family by the name of Fairfax, or I should rather say Barnes or Bates. Do you know any family of that name?
To be sure we do.
True. You are acquainted with Miss Fairfax.
I met her at Weymouth.
And a fine girl she is. Call on her, by all means.
She's a very elegant young woman.
Yes.
If you're not particularly struck by her manners before, I think you will be today. You will see and hear her to advantage. No, I'm afraid you will not hear her at all. She's an aunt who never holds her tongue.
Well, there is no necessity for my calling this morning. Another day will do.
If you do not call early, it will be a slight. Come, I shall show you the way.
He is very much of his father's spirit and liveliness. I felt immediately that I should like him. And I have no doubt of what Mr. Weston was often thinking of. I caught his quick eye glancing towards us with a happy expression.
The next morning brought Mr. Frank Churchill again. He was interested in the Crown Inn, an inconsiderable house, except that a large room had been vividly added, built many years ago for a ballroom. He lamented that its original purpose should have ceased. They ought to have balls there at least every fortnight through the winter. He argued like a young man very much bent on dancing. At last, he was persuaded to move on.
Have you paid your visit to the Bateses and Miss Fairfax yet?
Oh, yes. And felt very much obliged to you for your preparatory hints. If the talking aunt had taken me quite by surprise, it must have been the death of me.
And how did you think Miss Fairfax looked?
Ill. Very ill. Miss Fairfax is naturally so pale as almost always to give the appearance of ill health.
Not at all. There is a delicacy to her complexion which gives a peculiar elegance to her face.
I have heard people say so, but to me, nothing can make amends for the want of a fine glow of health.
Well, there can be no disputing about taste. Did you see Miss Fairfax often at Weymouth?
Ah, it is always a lady's right to decide on the degree of acquaintance.
Upon my word, you answer as discreetly as she could do herself. She is so very unwilling to give the least information about anything. But I really think you may say what you like of her.
May I indeed? I met her frequently at Weymouth. Colonel Campbell is a very agreeable man, and Mrs. Campbell, a friendly, warm-hearted woman. I liked them all.
You know Miss Fairfax's situation in life, I conclude, that she's destined to the care of others' children.
Yes, I believe I do. Did you ever hear her play?
You forget how much she belongs to Highbury. I've heard her play every year since we both began. She plays charmingly.
You think so, do you? I'm excessively fond of music, both of the small skill of judging anybody's performance. I remember one proof of her being thought to play well. A man, a very musical man, engaged to another woman, would never ask that other woman to sit down to the instrument if Miss Fairfax can sit down instead.
Mr. Dixon is very musical, is he? I cannot excuse a man's having more acute sensibility to fine sounds than to my feelings. How did Miss Campbell appear to like it?
Miss Fairfax was Miss Campbell's particular friend, you know.
Poor comfort.
It is impossible for me to say on what terms they really were. But you have known Miss Fairfax from a child and must be a better judge of her character than I can be.
It is natural to think that we should have taken to each other, but we never did. Her reserve.
A most repulsive quality indeed. One can never love a reserved person.
Emma's good opinion of Frank Churchill was a little shaken the following day by hearing that he was gone off to London merely to have his hair cut. But for this unfortunate fancy, there was nothing to denote him unworthy of the distinguished honor which Emma's imagination had given him, the honor of being marked out for her by all their joint acquaintances. Only one soul among them was not to be softened by Mr. Frank Churchill's bows and smiles, Mr. Knightley. When the circumstances of the haircut were given, Emma heard him say to himself,
Just the trifling, silly fellow I took him for.
With Tuesday came the agreeable prospect of seeing Frank Churchill again. A letter arrived from Mr. and Mrs. Weston inviting them to their house. The talk was all of a pianoforte.
I called on Miss Bates, as I often do, and as soon as I entered the room I was struck by the sight of it. Very elegant-looking instrument indeed, and had arrived from London the day before, entirely unexpected.
It must be from Colonel and Mrs. Campbell.
Most likely, of course. But Jane had a letter from them very lately, and not a word was said about it.
why do you?
Me? I suppose I smile with pleasure at Colonel Campbell's being so rich and liberal. It is a handsome present.
Very.
I rather wonder that it was never made before.
Perhaps Miss Fairfax has never stayed here so long before.
Perhaps, but what of Mr. Dixon? We were speaking the other day, you know, of his being such a warm admirer of her performance. I cannot help suspecting that, after making his proposals to her friend Miss Campbell, he had misfortune to fall in love with her. I'm sure there must be a particular cause for her choosing to come to Highbury instead of accompanying them on their visit to Ireland. And the arrival of the pianoforte is decisive. I may not have convinced you, perhaps, but I am perfectly convinced myself that Mr. Dixon is the principal in the business.
Indeed, you injure me if you suppose me unconvinced. I can see it to no other light than as an offering of love.
Ah, Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax, welcome, dear friends. We talk of nothing here but the new pianoforte.
Have you walked all this way as cold as the nights are now? I cannot bear to think of it. You shall have a carriage to take you home again.
Oh, Miss Weston, you are too kind. There's really no need to trouble yourself over us.
Ah, Miss Smith, welcome to Randall's, my dear.
Good evening, Mr. Weston. Here is my special little friend, Miss Smith. What do you think of her, Mr. Churchill?
Miss Smith? Oh yes, I must say I've never seen so lovely a face.
What's the matter?
Miss Fairfax has done her hair in so very odd a way that I cannot seem to keep my eyes off of it. Those curls! I must go and ask her whether it's an Irish fashion, shall I?
No.
I will, and you shall see how she takes it.
Well, Harriet, you have seen our Mr. Churchill. Do you not think him handsome?
Indeed, he's very handsome. And to think it is paying him too great a compliment, but I do think he resembles Mr. Elton a little.
Oh, Harriet.
My dear Emma, do you know how Miss Bates and her niece came here?
They won't. How else could they come? They have no carriage.
Very true, and I offer the use of our own. But Mr. Knightley's carriage brought them and is to take them home again, so thoughtful in intention.
Mr. Knightley is not a very gallant man, but he is a rather humane one.
You give him more credit for simple benevolence than I do, for, as Miss Bates was speaking, a suspicion darted into my head, unable to get it out again. In short, I have made a match between Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax.
Dear Mrs. Weston! How could you think of such a thing? Mr. Knightley must not marry.
Why ever not?
I have never had such an idea and cannot adopt it now. And Jane Fairfax, too. Old women.
She has always been a favorite with him, as you very well know.
But Mr. Knightley does not want to marry. He is happy by himself with his farm and his library and all the parish to manage. And how would he bear to have Miss Bates haunting Donwell Abbey all day long, thanking him for his great kindness in marrying Jane?
Well, Jane, Emma, do not mimic her. Upon my word, I do not think that Mr. Knightley will be much disturbed by Miss Bates. Little things do not irritate him. But the question is not whether it be a bad connection, but whether he wishes it. And I think he does. The interest he takes in Jane Fairfax, and such an admirer of her performance on the pianoforte. Might not this mysterious gift be from Mr. Knightley?
Mr. Knightley does nothing mysteriously. If he had intended to give Jane Fairfax a pianoforte, he would have told her so. I see no sign of attachment.
Mrs. Weston, if you'll play for us, it is agreed that we may dance.
Of course.
Miss Woodhouse, may I have the honor?
Certainly, Mr. Churchill.
It may be possible to do without dancing entirely, but once the felicities of rapid motion have been felt, it must be a very heavy set that does not ask for more. Frank Churchill had danced once at Highbury, and longed to dance again.
You and Miss Smith and Miss Fairfax will be there, Miss Woodhouse. The two Miss Coxes, 5. For 5 couples, there'll be plenty of room.
5 couples are not enough to make it worthwhile. There will be 10 couples at least. and I have no idea what possible manner they can be disposed of here at Randall's.
Might we not use both rooms and dance across the passage?
Oh no! Emma will catch a dreadful cold. This young man is very thoughtless. He does not think of the draft.
My apologies, Mr. Woodhouse. 10 couples may stand here very well.
It would be a crowd. Sad crowd.
There's no denying it. Still, having proceeded so far, one is unwilling to give the matter up.
Then I bring a new proposal to the subject. What do you say to a ball to be even not at Randall's, but at the Crown Inn?
The Crown!
Absolutely not. You will catch colds worse at the Crown than anywhere.
I was merely going to observe, sir, that one of the great recommendations of this change would be the very little danger of anybody's catching cold.
I do not understand how the Crown can be safer than your father's house.
From the very circumstance of its being larger, we shall have no occasion to open the windows. It is that dreadful habit of letting in cold air upon heated bodies which does the mischief.
Surely nobody would think of opening a window at Randall's.
A thoughtless young person will sometimes step behind the curtain and throw up a sash.
This does make a difference. However, we must not make resolves so hastily.
Unfortunately, sir, my time is so limited.
Perhaps you'd like to think it over, Mr. Woodhouse, while the young people come with us to examine the capabilities of the inn.
We will want all our neighbors' opinions. Suppose I invite Miss Bates to join us.
You will get nothing to the purpose from Miss Bates. She will be all delight and gratitude.
But she is so amusing.
Aye, Frank, go and fetch Miss Bates. I do not know a more proper person for showing us how to do away with difficulties. Invite them both.
Both, sir? The old lady?
No, the young lady, to be sure. I shall think you a great pluckhead, Frank, if you bring the aunt without the niece.
I beg your pardon, sir. I did not immediately recollect. But first, Miss Woodhouse, may I hope the honor of your hand in the opening dance of this projected ball?
You may hope, Mr. Churchill.
He has asked you, my dear. I knew he would.
Two days of joyful security were followed by the immediate overthrow of everything. Mr. Churchill wrote a letter to Mr. Frank Churchill saying that he must return to Austen immediately. Mrs. Churchill was far too unwell to do without him.
If I can come again, we are still to have our ball. Do not forget your engagement.
Not to be off this very morning? Not 5 minutes to spare for your friends Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax.
I have already called there. Miss Woodhouse, you are hardly without suspicion.
You were quite in the right. It was most natural to pay your visit.
Of all the horrid things, leave-taking is the worst. But Mrs. Weston will correspond with me and tell me everything. In her letters, I shall be a dear Highbury once again.
He's in love with me. In spite of every previous determination, I must be a little in love with him. For a few weeks at least. When he returns to Highbury, I must be on my guard not to encourage his affections, for my mind is quite made up never to marry him. I shall do very well again in a little while, and then it will be a good thing over. For they say everybody is in love once in their lives, and I will be let off easily.
When Mr. Frank Churchill's letter to Mrs. Weston arrived, Emma had the perusal of it. Miss Woodhouse appeared on its pages more than once, and never without a pleasant connection. Still, she found that she could do without the writer, and he must learn to do without her. Her resolution of refusal grew more interesting by a scheme for his consolation and happiness. Compressed into the very lowest vacant corner of the message were written these words.
I had not a spare moment on Tuesday for Miss Woodhouse's beautiful little friend. Pray make my excuses and adieu to her. Might it be possible? He was very much struck with the loveliness of her face. And for Harriet it would be
draw on Harry's hat, for evil in that quarter was at hand. Mr. Elton's wedding day was named, and he was soon to be among them again, he and his bride.
Oh, indeed it is, my love.
And not merely the house, the grounds. My brother, Mr. Suckling, will be enchanted with this place. People who have extensive grounds themselves are always pleased with anything in the same style.
I'm afraid when you see more of this county, you will think you've overrated Hartfield. Surrey is full of beauties.
Oh yes, Surrey is the Garden of England.
Many counties, I believe, are called the Garden of England.
No. I have never heard anyone Surrey called it. My brother, Mr. Suckling, has promised us a visit in the spring, and that will be our time for exploring. He will have his baroque landau, of course, which holds forth perfectly, and we shall be able to explore the different beauties extremely well. You have many parties of that kind here, I suppose, Miss Woodhouse?
No, we are very quiet sort of people, more disposed to stay at home.
Your father's state of health must be a great drawback. Let me recommend Bob to you.
My father has been there more than once, without receiving any benefit.
Oh, that's a great pity. For I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, where the waters do agree, it is quite wonderful the relief they give. And it would be a charming introduction for you, who have lived so secluded a life. A line from me would bring you a little host of acquaintances.
Thank you, Mrs. Elton, but our going to Bath is quite out of the question.
Well, we shall see. We have been calling at Randall's. Mr. Weston is an excellent creature, and she appears so truly good. She was your governess, I think? Having understood as much, I was rather astonished to find her so very ladylike. And who do you think arrived while we were there? Knightley himself. Knightley is quite the gentleman. I rather like him. And I quite rave about Jane Fairfax. Miss Woodhouse, we must endeavor to do something for her. She is in such obscurity, so thrown away. My resolution is taken. I shall have Jane Fairfax very often at my house, shall introduce her wherever I can, and shall be constantly on the watch for an eligible situation. But come, Mr. Reed, we must be off. Good day, Mr. Woodhouse. Miss Woodhouse, good day.
A little quickness of voice which rather hurts the ear, but I do not like strange voices.
Well, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think of her? I'm not at all surprised that you should have fallen in love. I find her very beautiful. Very nicely dressed, indeed. A remarkably elegant gown. I wish them happy with all my heart, and now I do not think I shall mind seeing them again. He is just as superior as ever, but being married, you know, it is quite a different thing. She seems a charming young woman, and exactly what he deserves. Knightley. Never seen him before in her life, and calls him Knightley, and discovers that he is a gentleman. I doubt whether he will return the compliment and discover her to be a lady. And Mrs. Weston, astonished that the person who brought me up should be a gentlewoman. Absolutely insufferable. Worse than I could have middle. I hear of her walking with the Eltons, sitting with the Eltons, spending a day with the Eltons. To endure the mortification of Mrs. Elton's notice, and to remain here month after month, she must be under some sort of penance. She's not to be with the Dixons. The decree is issued by somebody. Why does she consent to be with the Eltons?
We must consider when Miss Fairfax quits before we condemn her for what she goes to. Her aunt is a good creature, but as a constant companion must be very tiresome.
You are right, Mrs. Weston. Miss Fairfax receives attention from Mrs. Elton, which nobody else will pay her.
I know how highly you think Miss Fairfax.
Yes, anybody may know how highly I think of her.
The extent of your admiration may take you by surprise one day.
Oh, are you there? I would not have Miss Fairfax. Miss Fairfax would not have me if I were to ask her, and I'm certain I shall never ask her.
You are not vain, Mr. Knightley. I will say that for you.
So you have been settling that I should marry Jane Fairfax.
No, indeed, I have not. You have scolded me too much for matchmaking for me to presume to take such a liberty with you. Upon my word, I have not the smallest wish you will marry Jane Fairfax. Or Jane anybody. You would not sit with us in this comfortable way if you were married.
Jane Fairfax is a charming woman, but she has not the open temper that a man would wish for in a wife. I do not accuse her of want of feeling, but she is reserved. More reserved, I think, than she used to be, and I have an open temper.
Well, Mrs. Weston, what do you say now to Mr. Knightley's marrying Jane Fairfax?
I say that he is so very much occupied by the idea of not being in love with her, that I shall not wonder if it would end with his being so lost.
The great part of Mrs. Elton's new acquaintance, taking for granted that the bride must be as clever and agreeable as she professed herself, were well satisfied with her. Invitations to dine flowed in. Emma must not do less than the others. The persons to be invited required little thought. Mr. Woodhouse considered 8 at dinner the utmost his nerves could bear. Harriet begged to be excused. Jane Fairfax was invited in her stead.
What a life I am to lead among you! Upon my word, we shall be absolutely dissipated. From Monday next to Saturday, we have not a disengaged day. My dear Jane, what is this I hear about you tracing about all morning in the rain?
I went only to the post office. I always fetch the letters when I'm here. A walk before breakfast does me good.
In the rain? Oh, do not tell me.
I assure you, Mrs. Elton, it has done me no harm.
You shall not do such a thing again. The man who fetches our letters will inquire for yours and bring them to you.
You are extremely kind, but I cannot get my walk.
Say no more about it, my dear. The thing is decided.
Such solicitude about fetching her own letters. I wonder if the wet walk this morning produced any. There is a glow of complexion and spirits.
I get quite anxious about you, my dear. Have you really heard of nothing?
I have not yet made any inquiries. I would not wish to make any yet.
My dear, you know we cannot begin too early. You do not know how many candidates there always are for the first situations. A cousin of Mr. Suckling, Mrs. Bragg, had such an infinity of applications. Everyone wanted to be in her family, for she moves in the first circle. Wax candles in the schoolroom.
I would not wish you to make any inquiries at present.
We must begin directly.
Ma'am, this is no means my intention for you
Mr. Weston, back from London already.
I bring news, a letter from Frank. Read it, my dear. Read it to Emma.
He's returning to Highbury.
I always told you he'd be here again soon, did I not? The Churchills will be in London next week at the latest. As to Mrs. Churchill's illness, or nothing, of course, but they're coming on her account. She thinks Enscombe too cold, so they move southward. I hope I shall soon have the pleasure of introducing my son to you, Mrs. Elton.
Ah, yes, and I shall be very happy in his acquaintance.
To what can I attribute my rather considerable agitation on hearing this news of Frank Churchill? I must weigh my feelings. My own attachment has really subsided into a mere nothing. It is not worth thinking of. If he, who has undoubtedly been the most in love, were to return with the same warmth of sentiment, it would be very distressing. I do not mean to have my own affections entangled again. It is incumbent on me to avoid any encouragement of his.
It was a clear thing upon Frank Churchill's arrival that he too was less in love than he had been, but he was not without agitation. That Mrs. Churchill was really ill was very certain. He could not be prevailed on by all his father's doubts to say that her complaints were merely imaginary. It soon appeared that London was not the place for her. She could not endure the noise. They would remove to Richmond, a mere 9 miles from Highbury. One good thing was immediately brought to a certainty by this removal: the ball at the Crown Inn.
Nobody can think less of dress than I do, but upon such an occasion where everybody's eyes are to be upon me, I would not wish to be inferior to others, and I see very few curls in the room except mine. Frank Churchill is a capital dancer, I understand. We shall see if our styles suit.
And how do you like Mrs. Elton?
Not at all.
She will think you want to ask her for the first dance.
But I claim your former promise to me. Where is my father? When are we to begin dancing? Ah, at last.
disinclined to dance as well, Mr. Knightley?
Not at all. Miss Smith, will you do me the honor?
Yes, sir.
Knightley has taken pity on poor little Miss Smith. Very good-natured, I declare.
If I may.
Oh, Mr. Churchill, you are too obliging.
Mr. Elton's conduct and Mrs. Elton's looks, they were aimed at wounding more than Harriet. Emma, why is it that they are your enemies? You did want him to marry Harriet.
I did. And they cannot forgive me.
I shall not scold you. I'll leave you to your own reflections.
Can you trust me with such flatterers? Does my vain spirit ever tell me that I'm wrong?
Not your vain spirit, but your serious spirit. If one leads you wrong, I'm sure the other often tells you of it.
I do own myself to have been completely mistaken in Mr. Elton.
Well, in return for your acknowledging so much, I will say that you would have picked for Mr. Elton better than he has chosen for himself. Harriet Smith has some first-rate qualities which Mrs. Elton is totally without. I found Harriet to be much more conversable than I expected.
Was that not Dr. Perry who rode by so earlier on horseback? Whatever became of his plans of setting up his carriage?
I did not know he ever had such a plan.
Nay, he wrote me news of it months ago.
Upon my word, I have never heard of it till this moment.
Then I must have dreamt it. I am a great dreamer. I dream of everyone at Highbury when I'm away.
My dear Emma, do you think we perfectly understand the degree of acquaintance between Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax?
Yes, I do perfectly. Why do you make doubt of it?
You never had any reason to think that he admired her, that she admired him?
Never! How could such an idea possibly come into your head?
I have lately imagined that I've seen certain symptoms of attraction, certain expressive looks which I do not believe meant to be made public.
Oh, you amuse me excessively. I'm delighted to find that you can let your imagination wander, but it will not do. There is no admiration between them.
That is, I presume it to be so on her side, and I can answer for it being so on his.
But do tell me the particulars of your suspicions. I want every look described.
No, I will not make sport of it. Perhaps I'm mistaken. In any case, I will say no more.
Come, everyone, we must dance. Emma, set your companions the example. Everybody is lazy. Everybody is asleep.
I'm ready whenever I'm wanted.
With whom are you going to dance?
With you. You will ask me.
Will you?
Indeed I will. We are not really so much brother and sisters to make it improper.
Brother and sister, no indeed.
May I have the pleasure of this dance, Mr. Fairfax?
The impertinence of the Eltons had one happy result, the cure of Harriet's infatuation. It was as if her eyes were suddenly opened, and she were enabled to see that Mr. Elton was not the superior creature she had believed him. Harriet rational, Frank Churchill not too much in love, and Mr. Knightley not wanting to quarrel. How very happy a summer, Emma thought, must be before her.
She has fainted.
Harriet, my dear, what has happened?
Miss Woodhouse, it was so frightening. We had just set out on the Richmond Road. We thought it safe enough and...
Are we no longer to be safe on the Richmond Road?
Who took the Richmond Road, Harriet?
Miss Bickerton and I. We had just set out together when we happened upon a party of gypsies. A child came towards us to beg, and Miss Bickerton was so frightened she gave a great scream and ran off. And then I was assailed by half a dozen children, all clamorous and impertinent. I gave them a shilling and was moving away when I was surrounded by the whole gang demanding more.
And so I found her, trembling, and they loud and insolent.
He led me off and left them completely frightened.
You did the right thing, Mr. Churchill, bringing her here to Hartfield.
I thought of no other place.
Such an adventure! A fine young man and a lovely young woman thrown together. He wished he could get the better of his attachment to myself, and she just recovering from her mania for Mr. Elton. Extraordinary. Everything must take its natural course. I will not stir a step nor drop a hint.
After being long fed with the hopes of a visit from Mrs. Elton's brother, Mr. Suckling, the Highbury world were obliged to hear that he could not possibly come till autumn. The daily interchange of news was again restricted to accounts of Mrs. Weston, whose happiness must eventually be increased by the arrival of a child, and the situation of Mrs. Churchill, whose health every day seemed to supply a different report. Mrs. Elton determined that everything need not be put off till her brother's arrival, and that they should all explore the beauties of Box Hill immediately. But first, Mr. Knightley proposed a visit to his own Donwell Abbey, to gather the ripening strawberries.
My only objection to gathering strawberries is the stooping, not to mention the glaring sun. I am tired to death. Come, my dear, we must sit in the shade.
Have you perhaps seen Mr. Churchill pass by?
Charming Mr. Churchill. Why, no. I'm sure that if you had, we would have noticed.
You're so very late.
Perhaps his horse has been lame.
Yes, that is possible.
And now, my dear Jane, I must tell you my news. I have found for you the most desirable situation. It is not with Mrs. Bragg, as I had formerly hoped, but with a cousin of hers, superior in every way. I am wild to have the offer closed immediately.
Mrs. Elton, I am grateful for your concern, but as I explained before, I am not at all eager to find a situation just yet.
I will not hear your negatives, my dear. I insist upon being authorized to write an acquiescence for you by the morrow's post.
And he still does not come.
You fret too much, my dear. It is all just contrived to new malady, no doubt.
No, he wrote that he's onto so much better that he not a doubt to get into us today.
Mr. Knightley, would you be so kind as to show us the gardens?
Ah, yes, the gardens. I have heard much of them. Knightley, lead the way.
My pleasure. Oh, Miss Smith, will you walk on?
Yes, sir. There was a time when Mr. Knightley would have sworn Harriet as a companion, that they seemed in pleasant conversation. Might he be putting forward Robert Martin again? No, it is too old a story. Robert Martin has probably ceased to think of her. And she is behaving extremely well, betraying no emotion at the distressing news of Frank Churchill's delayed arrival.
Miss Fairfax?
Miss Woodhouse, would you be so kind, when I am missed, to tell the others that I have gone home?
Certainly, if you wish it.
You are not going to walk to Highbury alone.
Yes, would harm could come. It is a short walk of 20 minutes.
Let me order the carriage. You are fatigued already.
Miss Woodhouse, at times we all find ourselves wearied in spirits. Mine, I must confess, are exhausted. It would be the greatest kindness you could show me to simply let me on my way, and only say I'm gone when necessary.
As you wish, then.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, the comfort of being sometimes alone.
Madness in such weather. Absolute madness.
I do pity her. Such a home indeed, such an aunt. And the more sensibility she betrays of their horrors, the more I shall like her. As for you, Mr. Churchill, Mrs. Weston has been certain that your mare
It was not the mare that had caused my delay, but an increase of illness in my aunt.
I'm sorry to hear it.
Had I known how hot a ride I should have and how late I must be, I would not have come at all. Nothing kills me like the heat.
You will soon be cooler if you sit still.
As soon as I'm cooler, I will go back again. I could be very ill-spared, but such a point had been made of my coming.
Perhaps if you taste some refreshment.
No, I am not hungry. It will only make me hotter. Well, perhaps there's some spruce beer to be had.
I am glad I am done being in love with him. I should not like a man so soon discomposed by a hot morning. Harriet's sweet temple will not mind it.
As soon as my aunt is well, I shall go abroad. To Switzerland, perhaps. I am serious, Miss Woodhouse. I am sick of England, and would leave it tomorrow if I could.
You are sick of prosperity and indulgence?
I do not look upon myself as either prosperous or indulged. I am thwarted in everything material. I do not consider myself at all a fortunate person.
You are not quite so miserable, though, as when you first came.
No, you are my best cure.
We are going to Box Hill tomorrow. You will join us. It is not Switzerland, but it will be something for a young man so much in want of a change.
No, if I come, I shall be cross.
Pray then, stay at Richmond.
But if I do, I shall be cross still. I can never bear to think of you all there without me.
Choose your own degree of crossness then. I shall press you no more.
Well, if you wish me to join the party, I will.
They had a very fine day for Box Hill, but there was a certain want of spirits that could not be got over. Emma never saw Frank Churchill so silent and stupid. He said nothing worth hearing, listened without hearing what she had said, looked without seeing. And while he was so dull, it was no wonder that Harriet should be dull likewise. And they were both insufferable. When they all sat down, things got better, for Frank grew talkative and gay, making Emma his first object.
How much I am obliged to Miss Woodhouse for telling me to come today. I had quite determined to go away again.
Yes, you were very cross, and I do not know how, except that you were too late for the best strawberries.
I was fatigued. The heat overcame me.
It's hotter today.
Not to my feelings. I am perfectly comfortable today.
You are comfortable because you are under command.
Your command? Yes.
I meant self-command. It is rather too much to be talking nonsense at the entertainment of 7 silent people.
What shall we do to rouse them? Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she desires to know what you are all thinking of.
Is Miss Woodhouse sure she would like to know what we are all thinking of?
It is not something I should consider myself privileged to inquire into.
Very true, my love. But some ladies say anything.
They are affronted. I shall attack them with more address. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she waives her right of knowing exactly what you may all be thinking of, and only demands from each of you either one thing very clever, 2 things moderately clever, or three things very dull indeed, and engages herself to laugh heartily at them all.
Very well, three dull things. That shall just do for me. I shall be sure to say three dull things as soon as I ever open my mouth, shan't I?
Oh, ma'am, pardon me, but you will be limited as to number. Only three at once.
Oh. Well, I will try to hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable for her to say such a thing to an old friend.
I like your plan, Frank, and I will try my best. I am making a conundrum.
Come, sir, let us hear it.
Very well. What two letters of alphabet are there that express perfection?
What two letters express perfection? I am sure I do not know.
M and A. Do you understand? Emma! This is the sort of clever thing that is wanted, but perfection should not become quite so soon.
I protest. I must be excused. I have a great deal of vivacity in my own way, but I must be allowed to judge when to speak and when to hold my tongue. Pass us if it please, Mr. Turtle. Mr. Reed, shall we walk?
Certainly, madame.
How well they suit one another. Very lucky, marrying as they did, only knowing each other a few weeks in Bath. How many a man has committed himself on such a short acquaintance and rooted on the rest of his life?
Hasty attachments do arise, but there's generally time to recover. Only weak, irresolute characters suffer an unfortunate acquaintance to be an impression forever.
Well, I have so little confidence in my own judgment that whenever I marry, I hope somebody will choose my wife for me. Will you find somebody for me? Adopt her, educate her.
And make her like myself?
By all means, if you can.
Very well then, I undertake the mission. You shall have a charming wife.
Shall we join Mr. and Mrs. Austen?
Yes. With all my heart, I am quite ready.
Oh, look, here are the carriages. Come, let us gather the others. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates, Emma had not thought it possible?
How could I help saying what I did? Nobody could. I dare say she did not understand me.
I assure you she did.
I know there is no better creature in the world, but you must allow that what is good and what is ridiculous are most unfortunately blended in her.
But Emma, she is poor. She has sunk from the compass she was born to, and if she lives to old age, must sink more. To have you laugh at her, humble her, you, whom she has known from an infant, whom she has seen grown up from a time when her notice was an honor, oh, it was badly done indeed. This is not pleasant to you, Emma. It is far from pleasant to me, but I must tell you the truth while I can.
A whole evening of backgammon with her father was felicity to Emma compared to the wretchedness of the morning at Fox Hill. As a daughter, she hoped that no one could have said to her, "How could you be so unfeeling towards your father? I must tell you the truth while I can." She was just as determined when the morrow came that she might call upon Miss Bates.
How kind. I suppose your courage comes from Miss Joy. This does not seem much like joy. It will be very trying for us to part with our Jane, and she has a dreadful headache. But do not think us ungrateful, Miss Woodhouse, for such good fortune. Just To look at Jane, you would not see how delighted she is to have secured such a situation.
Where is Miss Fairfax going?
To Miss Smallridge, to be the charge over 3 little girls.
Mrs. Elton, I suppose, has arranged it?
Yes, Mrs. Elton had us come last night, and they decided.
You spent the evening with Mrs. Elton?
Yes, she would have us come. Not Mr. Knightley, though. He declined at the first, and Mr. Churchill went away again. But Jane took Miss Elton aside and said upon thinking about it, she was determined to accept the situation.
The piano portal!
What is to become of it? At the staging, knows not whether it was Colonel Campbell's present or his daughter's.
When is Miss Fairfax to leave you?
Within a fortnight. That's the worst of it. My mother does not know how to bear it.
It must be a severe trial in you all.
So very kind of you, Miss Woodhouse. But then again, you always were.
There is no bearing such an always.
I would not leave without first seeing you, but I have no time to spare. I'm going to London for a few days to visit John and Isabella.
Is this not a sudden scheme?
Yes, rather, I have been thinking of it some little time.
Dear Emma has been to visit Mrs. and Miss Bates.
Have you, Emma?
Yes. Are you and I also to be friends here?
Friends? Certainly. Well, good morning.
And how did you find Mrs. Bates and her mother?
They have news. Miss Fairfax will be going out in a fortnight to be the governess to 3 daughters of a Mrs. Smallridge.
I'm glad Jane is so well adjusted. You know, my dear, she is to be to this new woman what Mrs. Weston was to us. Ah, but I hope she does not become inclined to go and marry after it has been her home for so long.
I know that I, for one, shall never marry.
Oh, this is a new resolution. I hope it is not in compliment to Mr. Elton.
So superior to Mr. Elton.
Harriet, your expectation of never marrying results from an idea that the person whom I prefer would be too greatly your superior in situation to think of you. Is it not so?
I have not the presumption to suppose, indeed I am not mad. But it has been a great pleasure to admire him at a distance and think of his infinite superiority to the rest of the world.
Oh, I am not surprised. The service he rendered you was enough to warm your heart.
The very recollection of it, his noble look and my wretchedness before, in one moment, from perfect misery to perfect happiness.
Let his behavior be the guide of your sensations, Harriet. I give you this caution now because I will never again speak to you on the subject. Let no name ever pass our lips. I am determined against all interference. He is your superior, no doubt, and there do seem obstacles of a very serious nature. And yet, more wonderful things have occurred, and there have been matters of greater disparity.
Thank you, Miss Woodhouse.
The following day, an express arrived at Randalls. The great Mrs. Churchill was no more. How her death would affect Frank was one of the earliest thoughts of both the Westons, but it was now a more pressing concern to show attention to Jane Fairfax, whose health for the moment seemed completely deranged. Emma ordered the carriage.
Jane really cannot see anybody. Mrs. Elton could not come tonight, and Miss Weston made such a point, and Miss Perry had so much to say. But other than that, Jane really cannot see anybody.
Arrowroot of superior quality was speedily dispatched.
Poor Jane insists she's not in want of anything.
There can be no doubt that Jane is resolved to receive no kindness from me. I'm sorry, but at least have the consolation of knowing that my intentions were good.
Could Mr. Knightley have seen unto Emma's heart on this occasion, he would have found nothing to reprove. but Mr. Knightley remained in London, unaware that events would soon cut short his stay. One day, about 10 mornings after Mrs. Churchill's decease, Emma was called to Randalls.
Oh dear, Emma.
Dear friend,
What is it? Frank has been here this very morning on a most extraordinary errand. Oh, what will you say, Emma? What will anybody say when it is known that he and Miss Fairfax have long been engaged?
you are not serious.
There has been a solemn engagement between them ever since October.
Before either of them came to Highbury?
The alliance was formed at Weymouth, but kept secret for fear of Churchill's disapproval.
And now that she is gone, oh my dear Emma, it was our darling wish that you and he might be attached to each other. We were persuaded that it was so. Imagine what we have been feeling on your account.
I have escaped. There was a period in the very early part of our acquaintance when I was very much disposed to be attached to him. But it did cease. You may believe me, Mrs. Weston, it is the simple truth. But what right had he come among us with affections engaged and manners so very disengaged? How could she endure such behavior?
There are misunderstandings between them, Emma, very possibly arising from the impropriety of his conduct.
Impropriety? Oh, Mrs. Weston, it has sunk him in my opinion. So unlike what a man should be. None of that upright integrity, that strict adherence to truth and principle, which a man should display in every transaction of his life.
Nay, dear Emma, he has many good
And
qualities.
poor Jane at the point of going his governess.
He knew nothing about it, Emma. It was the discovery of what she was doing which determined him to come forward at once. Don't let us be so severe. I must love him, and now that I'm satisfied on your account, I'm anxious for us all turning out well.
I suppose we shall gradually grow reconciled to the idea. And I must congratulate you, Mr. and Mrs. Weston, with all my heart, on the prospect of having one of the most lovely and accomplished young women in all of England for your daughter. Well, I need no longer be unhappy about Jane Fairfax. She will soon be well and prosperous, and the mystery of the pianoforte is resolved at last. That was a boyish prank indeed. Well, I must communicate the painful truth to Harriet as soon as possible. Poor, poor Harriet.
Well, Miss Woodhouse, is this not the oddest news that ever was?
What news do you mean, Harriet?
About Jane Fairfax. I just met Mr. Weston, and he told me that Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Jane Fairfax have been engaged to each other for this long while. Had you any idea of his being in love with her? You, of course, might. You who can see into everybody's heart.
Can you seriously ask me, Harriet, whether I imagine him attached to another woman at the very time I was encouraging you to give way to your own feelings?
You do not think that I care about Mr. Frank Churchill? Miss Woodhouse, how can you so mistake me?
Mistake you?
I know we never agreed to name him, but considering his infinite superiority, Mr. Frank Churchill indeed.
Harriet, let us understand each other now. Are you speaking of Mr. Knightley?
I thought you knew. When we spoke of it, it was as clear as possible.
Not quite. I perfectly remember that I did not wonder at your attachment, given the service he had rendered you.
Oh! Miss Woodhouse, it was not the gypsies I was speaking of, but rather Mr. Knightley asking me to dance when Mr. Elton would not stand up with me.
Good heavens! Have you any idea of Miss Knightley's returning your affection?
Yes, I've noticed quite a change in him since we danced. He's begun talking to me much more than he used to, and in quite a different manner. The other day, when we were at Donwell, he seemed to be almost asking whether my emotions were engaged.
Is it not possible that he might have been alluding to Mr. Martin?
There was no hint of Mr. Martin. And Miss Woodhouse, I would never have thought of Mr. Knightley had it not been for you. You told me to let his actions be the rule of my own, and so I have.
Oh, that I had left her where I ought. He told me I ought. How that insisted on being first with Mr. Knightley. First in interest and affection. I'm not deserved it. I've slighted his advice. I've been insensible of half his merits. And still, he has loved me and watched over me from a girl. With an anxiety for my doing right that no other creature has at all shared. I have been universally mistaken. I have done mischief. I have been totally ignorant of my own heart.
The evening of this day was long and melancholy at Hartfield. A cold rain set in and added what it could to the gloom. The weather affected Mr. Woodhouse, and he could only be kept tolerably comfortable by almost ceaseless attention on his daughter's side. It reminded Emma of Mrs. Weston's wedding day, though Mr. Knightley had brought him then and dissipated every melancholy fancy. The prospect that was before her now was threatening to a degree that could not be dispelled.
Mr. Knightley to be no longer coming to Hartfield for his evening concert. How was to be endured?
Emma?
You have news to hear, Mr. Knightley. Now you are back from London.
If you mean Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, I've heard that already. I had a few lines on parish business this morning from Mr. Weston, and at the end of them he gave me a brief account of what had happened.
You were probably less surprised than any of us. You had your suspicions. You've not forgotten that you once tried to give me a caution. I wish I'd attended to it.
Time, my dearest Emma. We'll heal the wound.
Oh, you were very kind, but I'm not a model of that sort of compassion. I've acted in a way that I must always be ashamed, but I have no other reason to regret that I was not in on the secret earlier.
I'm pleased you can even say so much.
My vanity was flattered, and I allowed Mr. Churchill's intentions. He has imposed on me, but he has not injured me.
I've never had a high opinion of Frank Churchill, but he is a fortunate man. He meets with a young woman at a watering place, gains her affection, cannot even weary her by negligent treatment. His aunt is in the way, his aunt dies. He has used everybody ill, and they are all so delighted to forgive him. And if he and his family had sought round the world for a more perfect wife, they could not have found a superior.
You speak as if you envied him.
In one respect, I do envy him. You will not ask me what is the point of envy. You are wise, but I cannot be wise, and I must tell you what you will not ask, though I may wish it unsaid the next morning.
Oh, then don't speak it! Take a little time, consider, do not commit yourself!
Thank you.
I stopped you ungraciously just now, and I'm afraid I gave you pain. If you have any wish to speak openly to me as a friend, or to ask my opinion of anything you may have in contemplation, hear whatever you like.
As a friend. Very well. I accept your offer and refer myself to you as a friend. It was jealousy of Frank Churchill that sent me to London, but there was too much domestic happiness at my brother's house. Isabella was too much like you. My dearest Emma, for dearest you will always be. Tell me then, have I no chance of ever succeeding? Say no if it is to be said. I cannot make speeches. If I loved you less, I might be able to talk more about it. But you know what I am. I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England could have borne it. But you understand me, and at present I wish only to hear your voice.
I am your own Emma, Mr. Knightley. My hand and my word. I cannot marry you. While my dear father lives, any change in my condition must be impossible for me. He can never bear the loss, and I have said that I will not marry you.
My word! My dear Emma, all of Mrs. Weston's turkeys have been stolen. Can a housebreaking be far off? How are we to protect ourselves?
Papa, might our safety not be better ensured if Mr. Knightley were always on the spot?
Why, of course, my dear, but how can this be? Mr. Knightley is a kind fellow, but I would never ask him for this advice.
And so it were proposed that if Emma were to marry Mr. Knightley, they might all live together at Hartfield. The idea was given. Time and continual repetition must do the rest. Emma would have been too happy were it not for...
Poor Harriet! She will forget Mr. Knightley, of course, but it cannot be expected to happen very early. It's too much to hope of even Harriet to be in love with more than 3 men in 1 year. A few weeks spent in London has given us some amusement. I shall write to Isabella immediately.
Indulging in one scheme more, Emma procured an invitation for Harriet. Time passed on. Mrs. Weston's friends rejoiced in knowing her to be the mother of a beautiful little girl. Mr. Robert Martin was called to town on business and was asked to dine by John and Isabella Knightley.
Oh, Mr. Martin.
Miss Smith.
Only imagine now happening to me. How very odd.
Within a month from the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Martin, Mr. Elton was called on to join the hands of Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Knightley. The wedding was much like other weddings, where the parties had no taste for parade.
Very little white satin, very few lace veils. A most pitiful business.
In spite of these deficiencies, the hopes of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union.
First, we'd like to thank Mr. Connolly. Mr. Conley is really awesome.
Also, we'd like to thank Mr. Clark and Mr. Zudo for the beautiful costumes. Mr. Vita for also helping in the band. Oh, he's not here? Okay. And the last person we'd like to thank is our wonderful set designer, Josh Berman.
The last person we want to thank is Julia for being an amazing stage manager. So everybody did a really great job at the show, and everybody deserves another round of applause for all the effort that we
I want to impinge on your time for just a minute, and if you can just indulge me for a minute. This is my 5th NHS Drama Club production, and last year I acknowledged the people who were with me from the beginning for my first 4 years, came in as freshmen and are graduating this year, and I'd like to do the same this year. I want to, we have only a few seniors in the cast this year, and Helena is our new senior. Emily joined us last year, and so this is 2 years with us. Maddie joined us 3 years ago with someone. But David and Kira have been with me since they were freshmen, and so I want to just acknowledge the two of them. And say thank you very much for sticking with me, for sticking with us through the good times and all that. So, thank you for your time tonight. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I knew I was going to miss something. Ryan Turper, who's been with us. Ryan Wallace. It's been a long 2 months, folks. Ryan Wallace, come here, buddy. I'm sorry. Thanks again.